So far in this weaving, I've done strictly tabby weave with the purple and this cream color here. This second technique that I've included here, this diagonal, is dovetailing, which is demonstrated in another video on my YouTube channel. Now I'm going to demonstrate what is called the basket weave. And to do that, you need to double up your yarn on a needle. And again, I like to end my weaving, just leave that hanging. I'll show you how to tuck those ends in later. But when I begin a new color, I like to tie that on to the end of my first warp thread and then just push those ends to the back of my weaving. So the basket weave is similar to tabby, but instead of going over, under, one warp thread at a time, you're going over and under 2 at a time. And so you will be seeing a little bit of the warp threads. And that's done on purpose so that you can see something that looks like a woven basket, hence the term basket weave. Now when I do this, I want to make sure that my double-stranded yarn is laying right next to each other as I weave, not twisting. And I don't want to pull it too tightly. I want to leave it rather loose. And now when I come back, you see how I've gone over those last 2 warp threads. Now I'm going to go under them. Over 2, under 2, over 2, under 2. And I'm going to continue that to the end of my warp threads, ending with going under these last 2 warp threads. Pulling my yarn out gently and carefully so it doesn't tangle and knot. And then I'm going to make sure that when I do this, it's not twisted over itself like that. I want to make sure that they are laying right next to each other instead of being twisted around each other. It takes a little bit of effort to untwist them. You'll see that it really looks like a basket, like a basket weaving. It looks kind of cool. And for those of you in my classroom that are bemoaning the fact that this takes so long to weave in your cardboard loom, this covers twice as much ground in half the time. Again, over 2, under 2, over 2, 2 at a time. Doubling up your yarn, making sure your yarn is not getting tangled, and making sure that your yarn is laying right next to each other instead of twisting. And letting some of the warp threads show through. If you're a student of mine in the classroom, this weaving, I could finish this out with some tabby weave and pop it off the loom and call it a day, because I've got my 3 weaving techniques. I've got my tabby weave, I've got the basket weave, and I have the dovetailing. So that's my 3 minimum. But I'm going to show you a fun technique that can add to your weaving, and that's called the raya knot. So you see here I have pre-cut some pieces of yarn. They're about 6-7 inches long, and I'm going to use these to create some fringe. I'm going to create a couple of rows of fringe right here and then down below over here. So the way this works is you take the 2 ends and wrap them around 2 warp threads and then pull them up in the middle. And that is it. Now I can do a row of alternating green and white. Wrap them both around and pull them up through the middle. It's a little tricky working in this tight area here, but it's doable. Now you'll notice if I continue on this row, I'll have gaps in between each of these 2 warp threads. So on my second row of raya knots, I'm not going to go around the same 2 warp threads. I'm going to go around the connecting warp threads. And sometimes if your fingers aren't working right, use the needle. That'll help. So I'm going to stop there so I can show you what I mean about that second row. So my second row, I'm going to not do these same 2 warp threads here. I'm going to do these 2 warp threads here and wrap my yarn around them that away. And so you see how that kind of closes that gap a little bit. I'll do another one here. So instead of these 2, I'm going to use these 2. The trick to making raya knots stay put is to do several rows of raya knot, and I like to put some tabby weave or some kind of a tighter weave on either side of those raya knots. So let's do some more and see how this looks. Now that I've popped this off of the loom, you can see that my warp threads are kind of hanging out here a little bit. And that's just the nature of the beast. When you pull this off the loom, it's going to hang down a little bit because you're pulling at them, and you might find that you've scrunched up your weaving quite a bit. So what I'm going to do though, before I even this out and fix my basket weave and my raya knots, I'm going to make use of these warp threads hanging down here. And as you can see, I've pre-cut some yarn again for some fringe. So I'm going to take 2 strands, one of the purple and one of the off-white, and I'm going to fold them in half like that, and I'm going to loop them through my warp thread loops that are there. And then I'm going to open up that hole there like that in between my 2 strands and push my ends through pulling them into a tassel. And I'm just going to leave that last bit of weft thread hanging there, because no one will notice that, but I'll show you what to do with the other weft threads in a moment. So there's my 2 strands. Again, I'm going to fold them in half like that, creating a loop. I'm going to push that through one of my warp thread loops. Open up that loop, push my ends through, and pull it gently. So here you see I've finished the fringe at the bottom, attaching them onto the warp thread loops, and now I'm going to adjust my weaving to tighten things up here at the bottom and retrieve my basket weaving. And when I put down these raya knots, you can see my basket weaving got kind of scrunched up a little bit. So I want to pull down my raya knots and readjust my basket weave so that I can see those little bits of warp thread in the middle. And that'll tighten things up here and make things much nicer. And then, what about these little ends? Well, this is what I do there. I kind of weave and tuck them back into my weft threads, but I do it in a way where they're woven and tucked behind the weaving, so you no longer see them in the front. I know some teachers just have you kind of fold them over to the back and then tape them down. I don't think that looks very professional and very nice. If you tuck and weave just a little bit, it can look a lot nicer. Takes a little bit of work, but with the needle you can do that very easily. And then just check on the front and make sure it's not pulling or choking. And then when you get it to a point where it's secure, then you can trim that off a little bit. And you can see where I've added yarn in the middle of my weaving. I ran out here and there, and those are already tucked behind there. So here's one where I need to kind of weave that back in. Just pull that through with your needle and a bit of patience. And again, I want to check my front and make sure I haven't pulled it too tight and ruined the beautiful weave that I have on the front. And again, I get it to a point where it's secure. I can trim that off. Now, I'll take care of the rest of that later, but right now what I want to do is attach this bamboo skewer. And you can see how a full bamboo skewer is entirely too long for the width of this weaving. So I just want to measure that and cut it off to accommodate my width. And I want to cut off the pointy end so I'm not hurting anyone with that. And the way we do this again is just weave that in under the warp threads, those little loops. until you get to the end. Now what I've decided to do is cut 3 strands, one of each of the colors that I've used throughout my weaving. Now I could braid this together, I have 3, or I can just tie it on as I see fit. And I think I'm just going to tie it on. I want to make a knot here at one end and tie that on over here, and make a knot at the other end and tie that on over here. Now I may need to adjust the length of each of these sides, and I can trim that with my scissors if I need to, and I can weave that little bit back in. But there is my finished weaving. And I don't want to keep that pointy, dangerous end, so I'm going to mark it and cut it. And you can use an X-Acto knife or a pair of scissors. We're just going to